Bala Ilule, Reb Levi Yitzchok, was a descendant of Reb Baruch Shalom, the oldest son of the Tzemach Tzedek. Reb Baruch Shalom, while being the oldest son of the Tzemach Tzedek, he nevertheless was the only son of the Tzemach Tzedek who did not serve as a Rebbe, as a leader in a city. All the brothers became Rebbes in various cities. The youngest brother, the Rebbe Marash, became the Rebbe in Lubavitch, the Memala Makom of the Tzemach Tzedek, but Reb Baruch Shalom did not become a Rebbe. In a Sicha, the Frierdiker Rebbe once mentioned that Reb Baruch Shalom was Pishnayim Me'echov, and because of that, he did not take on the mantle of leadership, did not become a Rebbe. Chassidim say that the Tzemach Tzedek told Reb Baruch Shalom that in this schus, one of his descendants will become a Rebbe, and that he used the pasuk Dei Revi Yashuvu Heina, that the fourth generation will return here in this context. Chassidim say that when the Rebbe's Shidduch with Rebbe Chaim Mushke happened, the Rebbe's father, Reb Levi Yitzchok, said that he now understands that this was a reference to the Dei Revi from the Rebbe Maharash. In other words, not the fourth generation of Reb Baruch Shalom, but the fourth generation of Nesieh Chabad, that the fourth generation will be one of the descendants of the Reb Baruch Shalom. As we know, that is what actually materialized. Reb Baruch Shalom had three sons. The oldest son was Reb Mordechai, and he was a Rav in Vitebsk and later on in Chernigov. And Reb Levi Yitzchok, after whom the Baal HaIlule was named, this next son of Reb Baruch Shalom, he was a Rav in Padobranke and also in Beshenkovich, and he passed away very young at the age of 44. There was another son, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, who was called Reb Leib Rabashis, Reb Leib the son of Reb Baruch Shalom. There were also daughters. Reb Levi Yitzchok had a son who we all know as Reb Baruch Shneir, the father of the Baal HaIlule, Reb Levi Yitzchok. But Reb Baruch Shneir was not called Baruch Shneir at his bris. At the time of his birth, the grandfather, Reb Baruch Shalom, the son of the Tzemach Tzedek, was still alive. So they certainly did not give the name Baruch Shneir, as it is not the custom by Ashkenazic Jews to give a name after a living grandfather. Rather, he was called Shneir Zalman. The name Zalman is not usually used when we refer to Reb Baruch Shneir, but it is clear that his name was Shneir Zalman and not just Shneir, because there is a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe where he actually addresses him as Baruch Shneir Zalman, and we also see that in the file of the KGB when they arrested Reb Levi Yitzchok, and also in the files of his brother, they are referred to as Zalmanovich, as was the custom then, that they would write the name of the father as a family name or as a description of who the person is. So if Reb Levik was referred to as Zalmanovich and also his brother was referred to as that, that was because their father's name apparently was Zalman. So how come he wasn't called Baruch Shneir Zalman usually? And when did the Baruch come in? So for that, we have to go forward a couple of years later, when Reb Baruch Shneir married the daughter of Reb Zalman Chaikin. We know that when a son-in-law and a father-in-law have the same name, the custom is that one of them should change their name or add a name so that it shouldn't be exactly the same name. So the understanding is that Reb Baruch Schneer was called Schneer Zalman after the Alter Rebbe at his bris, and not Baruch Schneer Zalman, as we mentioned before, because the grandfather of Baruch Shalom was still alive. When it came to the time of the Chasana, at that time his grandfather was not alive anymore, and he needed to change his name somewhat in order to marry Rabbi Rachel, the daughter of Rabbi Zelda Rachel, the daughter of Reb Zalman Chaikin. So at that point, he took on the name Baruch, and the name Zalman, although he was called Schneer Zalman originally, wasn't the name that he was usually referred to. Rather, he was from now on called Reb Baruch Schneer, because his father-in-law was called Reb Zalman Chaikin. Reb Baruch Schneer was a chassid of the Rebbe Maharash, and he also later on traveled to the Rebbe Rashab and was a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab, and even later on to the Frierdiker Rebbe when the Frierdiker Rebbe was in Leningrad. Reb Baruch Schneer was a chassid mainly of the Rebbe Maharash. That was his years. At the time that he came to the Rebbe Rashab, he was also a chassid, and he was also considered a very respectable member of the family, and he used to eat at the Rebbe Rashab's table. Reb Levi Yitzchok writes to the Rebbe something that he heard from his father, Baruch Schneer, who heard it from the Rebbe Maharash. It just goes to show the type of chassidus and the relationship, that he was like a chassid of the Rebbe Maharash, that he said this interesting anecdote that the Rebbe Maharash said that the Shagas Aryeh learned Shas 600 times. But the Alter Rebbe, at age 30, as it says in the Hakdamah to the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, which was written by the sons of the Alter Rebbe, that at age 30 the Alter Rebbe finished Shas and the commentaries for the 16th time. Said the Rebbe Maharash that the 16 times that the Alter Rebbe finished Shas at age 30 are greater than the 600 times that the Shagas Aryeh learned Shas. And this vort of the Rebbe Maharash, Reb Levik writes to the Rebbe in a letter that he had heard this from his father, Baruch Schneer, who heard it from the Rebbe Maharash. The Baruch Schneer used to write down all the things that he used to hear from the Rebbe Rashab at these meals when he was in Lubavitch, and he would write down the different anecdotes and stories and other things that occurred in the presence of the Rebbe Rashab. These were later published as Reshimis HaRabash, the Reshimis of Reb Baruch Schneer. He used to also chazer the Maimorim that he used to hear. In general, he used to chazer Maimorich Chassidus on any occasion, but especially the Maimorim that he heard on Shabbos from the Rebbe Rashab, he would later on review them and chazer them. He would ask one of the Bachrim, the Tmimim in Lubavitch, to come to his Achsanya wherever he stayed, because he wanted someone to sit in front of him when he would chazer the Maimer. As reward, he would show these Bachrim some of his entries into his journals, the Reshimis HaRabash, the different anecdotes. And of course, Bachrim loved to see these things, so there was always someone volunteering to come to Reb Baruch Schneer to hear him chazer the Maimer. Rabbi Yudel Chitrik recalls how in Tafresh Ein Hey, 1915, one time Reb Baruch Schneer was in Lubavitch and he fell ill, so he needed someone to assist him, and Rabbi Yudel Chitrik was the one who assisted him. So he says that Reb Baruch Schneer heard a maimah from the Rebbe Rashab, and then later on he saw him walking back and forth, reviewing the maimah to himself with a lot of excitement. He also traveled still to the Rebbe, to the Friediger Rebbe, as I mentioned before. Chassidim recall how he went for Rosh Hashanah from Nevel to Leningrad, to Afresh Pehei, and the trip lasted for 12 hours. And throughout the entire trip, Reb Baruch Schneer was sharing words of Torah and Chassidus non-stop. All the Chassidim who traveled along with him were amazed at his knowledge and his depth. He was a very happy person. He always had a smile on his face. He always infused happiness to all who came in contact with him. As mentioned, Reb Baruch Schneer married Rebbe Zelda Rachel, who was a daughter of Reb Zalman Chaikin. Reb Zalman Chaikin, together with his brother Reb Yoel Chaikin, were Chassidim of the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash, and they were both, Reb Yoel and Reb Zalman Chaikin, Talmidim Muvhakim of Reb Pesach Malastovker. Reb Pesach Malastovker was still one of the great Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe and of the Mittel Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek would send Chassidim to Reb Pesach Malastovker that he should train them and teach them in the ways and the Darkei HaChassidus. In other words, which is an interesting point, when we look at Reb Levi Yitzchok, a direct descendant of the Tzemach Tzedek, the Mittel Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe, so obviously this is Beis HoRav Mamish. But also there was an influence from Chassidim, like Chassidim of the Rebbeim, but in a very direct line straight to the Alter Rebbe. When we think of it, that Reb Levi Yitzchok in his youth grew up in Podobranke, where his grandfather Reb Zalman Chaikin, his mother's father, lived, and Reb Zalman Chaikin was a Talmid of Reb Pesach Malastovker, who was a Talmid of the Alter Rebbe. So we can understand and appreciate the type of environment and Chassidische arum and background that Reb Levi Yitzchok grew up in. Reb Baruch Schneer had three sons. Reb Levi Yitzchok was born in Tafresh Lamed Ches in Podobranke, and then there was a brother Reb Shmuel and a brother Reb Shalom Shleime. When Reb Levi Yitzchok was young, in his childhood, in his youth, he learned by his great uncle, his grandfather's brother Reb Yoel Chaikin, who was the Rav in Podobranke. As mentioned before, also Reb Yoel was a Chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash, and he also, like his brother Reb Zalman Chaikin, was a Talmid by Reb Pesach Malastovker, from whom they learned the Darkei HaChassidus and Torah. Together with Reb Levi Yitzchok, there was also a grandson of Reb Yoel Chaikin who learned by his grandfather Reb Yoel at the time. That was Reb Menachem Mendel Dubravsky, who was also a brilliant man, a Goen Olam. And in their youth, when they learned by Rabbi Yoel, these two, Rabbi Yoel would at times ask them riddles, and with their genius minds they were able to come up with the answers. Mendel Dubravsky's grandson recalls a story that he heard that Rabbi Yoel would talk about the brilliance of these two Talmidim, and he would say that he remembers one anecdote that he asked them a riddle and they both came up with the answer, but Reb Levi Yitzchok got there first. He got the answer sooner. The Rebbe Rashab made the shidduch between Reb Levi Yitzchok and Rebbe Tzimchana. Rebbe Tzimchana was the daughter of Reb Meir Shleime Yanofsky. Reb Meir Shleime was the son of Rabbi Yisrael Leib Yanofsky and Rabbi Rivka, who was the daughter of Rabbi Avram David Lavut. Reb Meir Shleime's father, Rabbi Yisrael Leib Yanofsky, passed away young. So his father-in-law, Rabbi Avram David Lavut, took his grandson, Reb Meir Shleime, into his home and raised him like his son and taught him Torah. Reb Avram David was the Rav in Nikolaev. Before he passed away, he asked the people in the community that they should take on Reb Meir Shleime as the new Rav in Nikolaev. And due to Reb Meir Shleime's greatness, they complied and took him on as the Rav of Nikolaev. Reb Meir Shleime was from the Yoshvim by the Rebbe Marash, as the Rebbe also told us this few stories in this connection, that after the Chasana, the custom was that they used to go to Lubavitch and learn and daven and be in the environment of the Rebbe and Darkei Chassidus for a few years after the Chasana. So Reb Meir Shleime was from the Yoshvim by the Rebbe Marash. He was great in his knowledge of Torah, was a Rav, a Pesach, but also in Chassidus and Yiras Shamayim, and he excelled in Midas Tevis. He was an Oyev Shalom, he loved peace, and he was Bereach Min HaKavod. He was a very special person. His wife, Reb Meir Shleime's wife, was Rebbetzin Rachel, and she was the daughter of Reb Yitzchok Pushnitz, who was the Rav of a village, Dobrinka, which was near Nikolaev. Rebbetzin Rachel was therefore the grandmother of the Rebbe, and in Tafshin Nun, on a Yortzeit Chavdalat Tishrei, the Rebbe actually wrote about her an interesting anecdote that we didn't know beforehand, that in the Rebbe's childhood, in the Rebbe's youth, at the end of the summer, the family used to go back to Nikolaev, meaning Reb Levi Yitzchok and the family already lived at the time in Yekaterinoslav, but at the end of the summer, we don't know who exactly traveled, if it was only the children of Reb Levi Yitzchok and Rebbe Simchana, or if it was Rebbe Simchana and the children. The Rebbe is just writing about himself that we would go to Nikolaev, and this Rebbe Rachel Tiplobi, that's how the Rebbe wrote it, she took care of me at that time. After Reb Levi Yitzchok married, they lived in Nikolaev by Reb Meir Shleime, what is called Ankest, that Reb Meir Shleime, who himself wasn't rich. He supported the young couple, and that lasted for almost 10 years. During that time, Reb Levi Yitzchok was learning Torah 18 hours a day. There was a Yid, Reb Shmuel Grossman, who lived in Nikolaev, and he said this, that he had a kviyus to learn with Reb Meir Shloime early in the morning, before davening, 5 o'clock in the morning. And when he came to Reb Meir Shloime early in the morning to learn, Reb Meir Shloime pointed out to him how Reb Levi Yitzchok, who has been up learning the whole night, was now going to lay down for some time, but at 9 o'clock Reb Levi Yitzchok already was in the shul with the daily minyan for Shachris. He was learning, and Rabbi Tzemach said that her father wasn't a gvir, he wasn't rich, but the salary that he got, first thing he would always divide for the various people that he was supporting, and it was them, Reb Levi Yitzchok and Rabbi Tzemach, but there were also other members of the family that Reb Meir Shloime would support somewhat, and only at the end he left some money for himself. Rabbi Tzemach also says that Reb Meir Shloime was trying to supplement his income by selling esrogim, but he was such a Yerei Shamayim, so when a person would come to buy an esrog, Reb Meir Shloime would point out to him, are you sure you want this esrog? Maybe it's not so mehuder, check the pitim, look at this dot. So Rabbi Tzemach says it's self-understood that at the end of the season he was left with many esrogim unsold. Before the chasana between Reb Levik, Reb Levi Yitzchok and Rabbi Tzemach, the Kala fell ill, and Reb Meir Shloime thought to delay the chasana, push off the date for the wedding. So he sent a shliach to Lubavitch to ask the Rebbe Rashab for his opinion, and the Rebbe Rashab said not to delay the wedding, they should go on with the plan, and a bracha that the Kala will be well. And so it happened that the chasna was as planned on Yud Gimel Sivan in the year Tafresh Samach 1900. In a letter that the Rebbe Rashab wrote to Reb Levi Yitzchok's father, Reb Baruch Shneyer, wishing him Mazel Tov on the occasion of his son's Reb Levi Yitzchok's wedding, the Rebbe Rashab writes about Reb Levi Yitzchok, Rechumoi de Nafshoi, the beloved of my soul, which is a very unique title. If you may say so, we don't find by the Rebbe Rashab as much emotion expressed in his letters in comparison to, let's say, the Frierdiker Rebbe. And that the Rebbe Rashab should refer to someone who was really a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab. He was younger. He was about the age of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He was 2 years older than the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe Rashab writes about him, Rechumoy de Nafshoi, is a very unique expression, and it gives us an insight of the relationship that there was between the Rebbe Rashab and Reb Levi Yitzchok. We see that the Rebbe Rashab also instructed Reb Levi Yitzchok before the wedding about the ruchnistige preparations for a chasana, and we find this in a letter that Reb Levi Yitzchok wrote to the Rebbe before the Rebbe's Chasana years later, that he heard from the Rebbe Rashab before his wedding that under the chuppah you should contemplate about Yiras Shamayim the entire time. Interestingly, that in the Likutei Sichos, in the Likud that came out for Shabbos Yisroi Tafshin Memches, was the Shabbos before the Rebbetzon's Histalkus, the Rebbe asked that they should include in the back of the Likud a quote from a Maimer of the Mittler Rebbe, which had come to the Rebbe around that time, and the Rebbe writes that L'Te'elas HoRabim, people should know about this. He wants this quote to be included in the back of the Likud. In that quote, the Mittler Rebbe writes that chuppah is Pchinas Makiv, and while under the chuppah there is an empowerment and a sinas koyach, nimshach to the chasna and kala for all their avodas Hashem for the rest of their lives, and therefore they should connect their thoughts to Hashem while under the chuppah, which apparently is the earlier source for this idea. But we see that the Rebbe Rashab shared this with Reb Levi Yitzchok before Reb Levi Yitzchok's wedding. After the Chasana, as mentioned, they lived in Nikolaev, Ancestry by Reb Meir Shleime, but they also traveled to Podobranke to visit the Reb Levi Yitzchok's father, Reb Baruch Schneier. Rabbi Tzimchana recalls this in her memoirs, that they traveled to Podobranke. They were by her father-in-law, Reb Baruch Schneier. Reb Baruch Schneier lived in a brick house which was built for him by his father-in-law, Reb Zalman Chaikin. Reb Zalman Chaikin was still alive at the time in Podobranke. So Rabbi Tzimchana recalls, and she would cherish the bracha that the grandfather, Reb Zalman Chaikin, benched her on that occasion. Later on, Reb Levi Yitzchok became the Rav in Yekaterinoslav. And Reb Avram David Yanovsky, who was a cousin, he was a cousin to Rebbe Tzimchana, he stayed and learned by his uncle Reb Meir Shleime Yanovsky. And he says a very interesting story, that on one occasion someone came from Yekaterinoslav to Nikolaev and told Reb Meir Shleime that Reb Levi Yitzchok fell ill. He had a lung infection and he is bedridden. So the Reb Meir Shleime went into a state of dveikus. He put his one leg on a chair and he stood there singing his volach, one of his nigunim, deep in thought. And then he said, if something chas v'sholem has been decreed in heaven against Reb Levi Yitzchok, that chas v'sholem he should pass away, will ich sein der Farbeit for him, I would like to replace him. Reb Meir Shleime was a Rav in Nikolaev, but he felt that Reb Levi Yitzchok's life is more precious, and if it was decreed, then that decree should rather be on him rather than on Reb Levi Yitzchok. Also, when they were already living in Yekaterinoslav, they would occasionally visit Nikolaev, as mentioned before, from the Rebbe's own zichronos. And an interesting anecdote in this context, the Rebbe's father, Reb Levi Yitzchok, the Baal HaHilula, when he would write the letters to the Rebbe, once the Rebbe was not in Russia anymore, he would usually write the place from where he is writing the letter, together with the date. And there's a letter on Erev Rosh Hashanah in the year Tafresh Peites, it's the Erev Rosh Hashanah for the year Tafresh Tzadik, he writes from Nikolaev. This is very interesting. How did Reb Levi Yitzchok, who at the time was a Rav in Yekaterinoslav, end up being on Erev Rosh Hashanah in Nikolaev? We don't know for sure, but there is a story told by the Meir Itkin, Alav Hashalom, who in his younger years, he was in different yeshivas, underground yeshivas. He ended up in Yekaterinoslav and he was there for a while. So he said that the apartment where Reb Levi Yitzchok and Rabbi Tzachana and the family lived was divided by the communists and made first into 2 apartments, and then later on it was made into 4 apartments. So the apartment, the living quarters for Reb Levi Yitzchok and his family became smaller and smaller, and it wasn't feasible to live like that. So the Chassidim, the townspeople in Yekaterinoslav, who were close to Reb Levi Yitzchok, somehow scraped together money to get a different apartment for Reb Levi Yitzchok. But there could have been a time in between where the apartment wasn't ready yet and they basically didn't have where to live. So possibly they were forced to travel to Nikolaev for Yom Tov at the time, and that's why he would have written the letter from there. However, for Simchas Torah of that year, Tafresh Tzadik, we know from the Zichronus of Reb Meir Itkin that Reb Levi Yitzchok was already back in Yekaterinoslav.